Okay, so, this is your time. So as always, please make this about whatever you want to make it about. But I am always curious to know, as you read chapters 5 and 6, if there were things that you were like, boy, I just don't know how to do that, or wow, that was a really cool idea, or hey, I've seen some of that play out in my significant relationships, or hey, I've tried that and it felt really strange, or it felt really life-giving, or I don't know what to do next. I mean, any of that stuff, I'd be really grateful to hear from you. Peggy,
I just finished reading Four Winds, and the discussion in the nonviolent communication discussion, I think it was in chapter maybe 6, where he talked about the argument between the farmers and the farm workers, and that was probably the climax of Four Winds. So if you want a really good book to read, put that Four Winds on your to read list, because they had the same issue there, and it wasn't settled. I don't think it still is settled today.
just curious, Peg, have you read the book Ishmael about the monkey, the talking monkey?
No.
Because you're referencing the farmer bit, I suspect you would find that worth your time.
Good.
So I had something that kind of resonated with me in chapter 5, and hearing him, what I took from it, that it's okay to be both caring of others' needs, which is often, as you described, women often take on that role, but also okay to express your own needs. So then, of course, the challenge is the balance and when to give and take, or try to accomplish both.
Yeah.
And so that's, haven't got there, and still reading, but that's something I definitely marked and noted and pondered about. And I'm interested if anybody has come up with a way to try to balance. I know you all are very giving and serving people here, so how do you do that?
Thank you. Does anybody want to take that on? That's a great question. Darlene?
I'd like to just kind of add to Adele's identification with his talk about how difficult it is for women to express their feelings. We're supposed to be attuned to other people's feelings,
Yes,
to our detriment. I've just finished reading 2 years of my aunt's journals, in which she made an entry every day for 2 years. And she was at a particularly vulnerable age. A young woman had left home for the first time, followed her husband into the war, and he was coming in and out of her life. It was a year in which she birthed her first child. Everyday entry, there was no, for 2 years, there was no labeling of emotion, not once. So I come from a long family history of not expressing emotions, and even a prohibition against sharing emotions. There was one time, actually 2 times, she would allude twice to feelings, but you had to read into it. She said, "This is a blue Monday," or the other time was she was embarrassed. She did use the word embarrassed, but that was about sharing emotions. And that was, she was embarrassed that she cried when her husband left to war and left her alone. It's no wonder that as a young woman myself, a young adult woman, I had trouble expressing my feelings, and I still do. Yeah. But I realized that it was a detriment to what I was trying to do at the time. I was working in Southern California, out in the desert, working with Hispanic young women who I wanted them to have a full life and be able to be assertive. Well, I couldn't help them because I didn't know how to do it myself. So I had to go for assertiveness training, and that was in the 70s when it was just starting. And I had to learn it for myself before I could teach it to them. And we're still struggling with that as women now.
Thank you. I actually, if that's okay to say, I think this is a huge struggle, albeit differently nuanced for both genders.
Yes.
Men are allowed to express anger and
Yes.
satisfaction, but not joy and not sadness. Women are not allowed to be angry, right? And can express joy, but it's hard for women to express satisfaction. So, you know, like, I just, what I think the author does, and I'm using the word think on purpose, that I appreciate, is talks about how just how we struggle culturally with things like feeling. And again, like he dresses up like, we're so afraid we'll hedge it by using the word I think, because it's okay to be cognitive, when really we're trying to express a feeling. I'm curious to know if anybody found yourself in the 4 options for receiving messages: blame yourself, blame others, sensing our feelings and needs, or sensing others' feelings and needs. And I'm going to tell you honestly, I usually, my initial gut check is always 1 or 2. Blame the other person or blame myself. It's almost always where my energy initially goes. And, you know, again, the other 2, I think, are opportunities for us to myelinate, like saying, okay, energy, I see you going to blame, but let's put it somewhere else. Just curious where you found yourself in those sort of 4 responses that he puts before us. Julia?
I agree. I mean, I definitely 1 and 2, those are my go-tos. Like very, very quickly. I think what I typically do is I do 1. So I blame myself, and then I don't like the way that feels. So I'm like, no, I'm just going to blame them. That was their, you know, that was them. Like, I'm not, you know, it's not really me. They were the ones who said that thing and blah, blah, blah. I feel like with my work, I really try to dig hard for like sense others' feelings and needs. And I feel like when I do that, I make more connections. But then with 3, it's just really hard for me to sense my own feelings and needs about things a lot of the time. I mean, I found myself, I don't know, sadly trying to be like, well, what do I really need, or what do I really want in a situation? And I felt like a lot of those examples that he gave about, you know, really trying to pin somebody down about what their need was, like it was so hard for them. And I was like, well, I appreciate that, because yeah, I feel the same way. It's really hard sometimes. What is it at the bottom of all of this that I'm really trying to get at?
Thank you.
And I'm probably the oldest person in this group here, in my mid 80s or early 80s. And it's funny, not funny, but it's been different thinking about that in terms of now versus when I was younger, much younger, like you, at your age, raising kids. And in some ways, there's no doubt aging is difficult, but I find a sense of freedom in that. That I don't do a lot of finger pointing at all, and maybe Tim and I are very blessed. So we spend so much time together and we get along really well. So I don't know. It's just a statement. I'm not sure that it does anything for anybody else in the room, but the aging is different. As I see the emotional stuff differently. I'm more objective also about how decisions I made when I was younger, I look at them differently. I don't judge myself about it. I don't think, badly, or I shouldn't have done that, or I shouldn't have done this thing.
The thing I found when I was younger, when I was going to college, I worked as a waiter in a restaurant, in several restaurants, and you get to sense the needs of people very fast if you're a good waiter.
Mhm.
You can just you just have a sense of what's going on because you work for the tips, and so you really have to know exactly how your customers are feeling and what they need. And so I've carried that over in my food service career.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I am curious to know, first of all, I want to say this is what's a blessing of being in community, is people saying like, hey, aging can bring a lot of perspective. You don't need to be afraid of it. And like, you're not too young to adopt that perspective now. Right? I find that like the best part of being in community is like that kind of mentorship. Like this is part of our journey we get to share together. I also think, and I don't know about you all, in my upbringing, it was always honorable and great to help other people, but needing or wanting help was a sign of weakness. Can I just show of hands, was anybody else raised that way? I'm going to out myself too, and this is going to sound silly, but like this is like, I'm having to go to a coach about my sabbatical because I really am good at multivariable calculus. I really am, like mathematically as well. And the variables I love to introduce are things like value and certification and like productivity. But if you ask me what I want to do, I'm terrible. I have no idea what I want to do for my sabbatical. I know how to make it enriching. I know how to make it potentially beneficial for the community. I know how to rack up certifications, but I'm awful at knowing what I want. And I think this book really says like, wow, let's think about that. Let's think about what we want, because a lot of times we don't even know what we want. We've like internalized what we're supposed to do. And again, like that line that I mentioned to you, when somebody says like, good job, the best response is, roof. Because like dogs do good jobs. Dogs are good boys and good girls, right? I mean, like, good girl. Roof. It was so funny, right? And I've read some of these other bits, right? It's like we talk about whether our kids are good boys or good girls, and usually the criterion is, were they quiet? And that has nothing to do with being good. It has nothing to do with learning. I read a book that says actually quiet classrooms are not conducive to learning. Now look, as a teacher, I love when kids are quiet because I can tell them everything they need to know and they can regurgitate it back out, but that doesn't correlate with learning at all. And so I feel like this book is, and I'm going to tell you, I struggle sometimes. Like I want to tell somebody something, and I'm like, I don't even know how to say that without being evaluative or like blaming, or like, not saying like a word like good. It's just really, really hard.
I have something that also caught my attention in there in that section about wants and expressing your wants. He said, I don't have it in front of me, about depression, his connection with depression and not expressing wants. And I can certainly see where, yes, that would be true, but isn't, clinical depression much more than that? I felt he simplified it a little too much, or maybe he talks more about it later.
I obviously clinical depression, which now shows up as a mental illness, and very few of us have like figured that out, right? Like if you've had 3 or more short-term depressive episodes, that shows up in the DSM, right, as a mental illness. And I think that's really helpful for us to realize, like, mental illness does not mean that you're bipolar schizophrenic, and that a lot of us have this going on in our lives or our children and our family. And I don't think he wants to like, well, I don't know what he wants to do. I suspect he's not trying to overly simplify, but I do think I think what he's trying to say is a lot of us succumb to things that are depressing or depression without even realizing we're doing it. Because, and this is not in the DSM, but if we're always living based on other people's expectations, then there's very little alive in us. You know, life with a capital L is externally defined, and that's enshackling. You know, that's not liberating at all. I think that's really what he's trying to say, and that a lot of us, and I'll include myself, we suffer from essentially low-grade depression, let's call it that, because again, like, we don't even know what we want.
So if we don't know what we want, we don't know how to get it either. And leaves us frustrated and angry at other people around us, or whatever.
And I think part of that too is that, you know, this comes back to the needs. And he says this in the audiobook. It's like, here are just people that have a Santa Claus mentality about their needs. Like, ho, 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 I'm about to give you a great gift. I have this need that you can meet. That is so contra my upbringing, but I do understand, especially with my kids, when I can meet their need, there's nothing I'd rather do than like legitimately meet their need. Or if I know what my spouse wants, I'd love to give that. You know, I struggle when like, I don't know if this is going to work. But if my spouse says, hey, like, here's a really easy way to show you love me, boy, that's an easy thing to do. What's not easy is like the things he says in the book. Well, to meet my needs, I want you to know what I want before I want it and just do it.
To have that kind of relationship with your wife, that you're that honest with each other, is quite a gift and a wonderful thing for a couple. That isn't true with lots of people.
Yeah, and I'm struggling into it, Graciela. I just have to be honest. This is part of like the growing up, and I don't want to like create a weird tone, but even like, you know, to be able to tell somebody like, hey, I would really like you like to snuggle, or I would really like you to rub my back for a minute. I don't know why that feels so awkward to ask, but I got to say, when I'm asked to do those things, I know exactly what to do.
How about instead of, to kind of ease into that, instead of asking for it, just expressing, I like it when we snuggle.
Yeah.
Or I feel closer to you when we snuggle. Just expressing our feelings.
Yes.
Doesn't make us have to ask for it.
I do want to say, like, I think every couple has to figure out how you do that, because we all can do that differently. And I think what the author does really well is he says there's a difference between an ask and a demand.
Yes.
Usually you don't know till it's over which one it was, but I do think, you know, the ability to have that in your head and say, hey, I would really appreciate the opportunity to do blank with you as an ask. And again, you know, it's a demand if your partner can't grant that or doesn't want to, or doesn't feel like it. You say, okay, maybe next time. I think sometimes we're so sometimes I'm so bad at expressing what would give me life regularly that I'll wait, and then I'll do it at the worst possible time, right? And it sets myself up for failure, and I'll take the message, we'll see, never express what you want, because you asked and they didn't give it to you.
And that waiting builds the anxiety in us.
Yeah.
And so we do it at the very last moment. And so there's that intensity that comes out more as a demand.
Yeah. And we'll say weird things like, well, I asked you one time. I asked you that time and you didn't do it. Yeah, okay, like give me some more opportunities. So, and this isn't in the book, but I did do some training with this marital work called Imago, and I mentioned it to some of you if you were here long enough. Instead of making demands on your spouse, you make a behavior change request. And it's really clear, like if you request your partner or your children or your siblings to change their behavior, it's truly a request. You say, because you love me, I would like you to change this behavior by doing this, this, or this. Do you feel comfortable with one of those? No, I don't. Well, what could you do? So it's a specific thing, and he says that in the book, right? You clear is kind. Brene Brown uses that language, but a lot of times when you say like, well, don't bother me anymore, the question is, well, what do you want them to do? We can't just say what we don't want. That's not life-giving to anybody. We can say, here's how I'd like you. When I do something that irks you, I'd like you to express it to me at such a time in such a way. It takes some of the romance out, because again, I would love my spouse to know me so well that they know what I need before I do, but that's just not realistic.
Father Mike, I've not read all of Brene Brown, but I have my master's in counseling, and I applied it primarily in schools with children. But the skills that you learn, you can apply in your marriages with your own kids, and there's approaches and techniques that work. And it wasn't that I became so text oriented and I did it just like the book said. I don't mean that. But there was a way to approach, because I knew intellectually a little bit more about how to communicate. I could apply that. And I'm wondering if Brene Brown approaches some of her book in that way, in terms of saying this might not work, but this might. I don't know. I'm just trying to clarify what she's got.
I think, Graciela, that Brene Brown, like most people, they tell us what we already know is probably right, but in language that escaped us, Okay,
yes.
I think most of us have some kind of sense, truly, about like what's going to be helpful and not, but having the script or the turns of phrase can be really, really challenging. And so like Imago, Brene Brown, and Marshall Rosenberger, I feel like give us some script language.
Yes.
And this is part of why I'm an Episcopalian. Truthfully, words matter.
Yes.
Because words create our reality.
Yes.
And so like, this is why I appreciate the prayer book. This is why I appreciate specific turns of phrase, because words matter.
Right. And I guess for me, having been raised as a Catholic, things like the Stations of the Cross, the Rosary, and things of that nature, because it's the Rosary especially, because you can pray that alone, and just the action of taking the beads and refocusing your head can really do a lot to rethink what it is you're going through, and remembering that God is there. I hope this doesn't sound corny, but that He's always there. He's always there to help, and all you have to do is talk to Him. And it's not all you have to do. It's not that simple, but I don't mean to sound that way. But so it sounds like she does give you the options on how to approach that interaction.
And I think that's part of the gift of this book, is some approach. And I have to say that for me, my language is so like, I'm 42. I've been using language the way I've been using it for 42 years. And most of you all are older than I am, right? Like we've got these very set pathways. Truly, we know how to walk them well instinctually, but they're not taking us to life. So the question is, can we make a new pathway? And that takes a lot of work. And I think that's really important to hear. It takes a lot of work. the payoff, right, is life with the capital L. I mean, that's where this is going. It's not discipline for its own sake. It's really like bushwhacking a path that doesn't meander, frankly, down into hell, like that takes us the other way. Mike, it looks like you're going to hop on. I can't tell.
Yeah, just trying to unmute. So that's just that exchange that you guys just had was interesting to me, because I mean, I was always taught that sacraments are physical things that we do that link us to spiritual realities. Mm-hmm. And to think of this stuff and I statements and expressing yourself clearly and things like that as a sacrament is an interesting idea. Like, this is something that we're doing that connects us to something greater, and that greater thing would be all of us as parts of the body of Christ. So interesting discussion.
Yeah, maybe I should tell you that some people, we have all these like definitions about sacramentality, right? And so there's people who talk about they're true sacramentarians and they're real sacramentarians and they're low sacramentarians, right? But the definition of the sacrament, according to the prayer book, is an outward sign of an inward and visible grace. I had a professor that told me that a sacrament is a way of participating in God without exhausting what participation in God means. And I think we sell ourselves short when we only focus on 7. Learning is sacramental. As I read the gospel, Jesus learns. And that's when I learn, I'm participating in who God is. Apologizing is sacramental when it comes from the heart. Actually, our Muslim brothers and sisters have almsgiving as one of their 5, and we don't have that as a sacrament. We don't. But generosity and gift giving, I tell you, is sacramental. I mean, if God is a giver, when we give from our heart, we're participating in God without exhausting participation in God, right? I mean, so, again, I think this is what really, really matters. And what's funny, right, is that sometimes I think we have such tight, I did use the word think. Yeah. Sometimes I in my own experience, I have such tight definitions. Sacrament means that thing you do with the chalice and the wine, that I sell short that holy living with the W and an H is what sacramentality is all about. It's not what I do just in church. Church is supposed to support sacramental living every moment of every day. And I think this book gives us some guide. Again, I'll just tell you what I love about the prayer book is that sometimes I'm so worked up, I just don't really even have words that adequately express what I'm feeling inside. And it can be really awful trying to invent those words in the moment of my need. And so quite often, actually, I'll read something in a prayer in the prayer book, and I'll think, I really will find myself thinking boy, that expressed what I wanted to say and didn't know how. Better than I could, and more, I don't know, adequately than I could. And I think that's the goal here is having these particular sacramental scripts allow us to really drill down to what we're feeling at the deepest level. And a lot of times we'll focus on the stimulus instead of where I am, and that's where I see this playing out really, really helpfully. I've talked to a couple engineers and they've said, this is not helpful in engineering. Yeah, I think it is. I don't know. I'm gonna argue with that. I was talking to a parent this week who happens to be a pretty important NASA engineer. I'm well, I don't even know how to do that with my kid. And I got to tell you, it doesn't come naturally to me either. But having just done it with my adult kid, oh my God, it was a miraculous connection. I don't know if I can do it again, but those 2 days I spent with my kid doing this this kind of work were like so incredibly life-giving to both of us. You know, it's like I made this mistake of thinking like my job as a parent is to control my kid and make my kid a good kid. Instead of to like connect with my kid, you know? And again, like I'm really good at making requests that are actually demands. And being clear on that is really important. I guess it's not that it's bad that we sometimes make demands of our kids. Let's just be really clear whether we're requesting or demanding. And I'm usually not that clear. I asked you and you didn't do it. That's a demand. So then just make the demand. Don't even ask. You know, like let's not dress it up. Let's just make the demand. Alan.
I like the on page 52 where they talked about connecting your feeling with your need.
Yeah.
On how you phrase things. So for example, a current day example, I really upset about SB 8 because I'm concerned about women's health. Or I'm upset about what happened on January 6th because I'm concerned about our democracy. Now, I try to have these dialogues with people that are on a very opposite view, and it doesn't get very far.
Yeah.
Because they're so locked in to their position, trying to find common ground in those two subject areas, finding really hard to do. These are people that are educated, some are relatives, some are friends, but it's really created a divide. I'm trying to figure out how to get across. And I thought that was connecting your feeling with the need is one way to get there, but then what's the next step?
Well, I think it's a really great question, and I'm going to enter into the world of what I think, right? Which is that I think, having grown up with a very different mentality, that we don't ever teach somebody something they're not willing to learn. And having been an educator before, there were teachers much more pedagogically apt than I was, but their students refused to learn from them. And I saw really like poor pedagogy teachers who had a real connection with their kids. The kids wanted to learn from them and would try, even when the teacher was not doing a good job. The kids chose because they felt safe. Now, I've got to tell you, Alan, because this is like most of my family I struggle with regarding things like SB 8 and masking and things like that. And, you know, part of what Marshall Rosenberg does, and as we continue to read, is he chooses to spend time with people. So I had somebody come up to me last week after I gave a sermon that was about, I thought, something other, and said, you know, I heard you talk about sacrificing and not sacrificing life, and all I was thinking about were these unborn babies that are being killed. Now, that was not what I was talking about. I didn't think I was talking about that. But I think the response is like, so you have a need, or you have this value of creating boundaries that really support and help life. And that's just a reflection. Now, I know that here's what I do. A lot of times I judge that and I say, yeah, okay, well, really, you're just pro-birth. You don't want to support these children or these women at all. That's what I want to do. But truth is, if I can spend a little bit of time and drill down to what they're valuing, we honestly value the same things. A container and a boundary that supports life. The variable is like what we want to do with that policy-wise. And if I say, well, you don't think like I do, so you're wrong, or like we can't be together, I really am missing the opportunity, even in the middle of a disagreement, to make an empathetic connection with somebody else. It's a lot of work. And to be honest, a lot of times I just don't want to do it. I'm tired. And there's people who I feel like I've had this conversation with, and I'm just tired. And, you know, that's where I can say, you know, this conversation is not really meeting my needs. I wonder if it's meeting yours. And if so, could you tell me how? I'm just curious to know. And those are some of the phrases that he gives. But I mentioned this a couple times. You're going to read this, I think it's this week, where he, you know, this is a Jewish man who gets in a car and the fellow passenger says something like, boy, these kikes get up really early to figure out how to cheat you out of your money. And he doesn't say, like, you should be ashamed of yourself, which I think he probably could say. Because to do that, right, we get now there will be no dialogue. I don't like being the bigger person. And by the way, when I use that word bigger person, it betrays how I've already evaluated the other person, you know? And this, I think, is the books that suggest, like, in those moments, like, let's drill down to where you are spiritually. Of course, we all think we're right. Otherwise, we'd change our mind. I mean, let's just be honest. I don't know anybody that's like, boy, I love being wrong. And I think, like, you know, there's this quote by, is it Aristotle? It's the mark of an educated mind to entertain a proposition without being converted by it.
That's right.
And I'm often really uneducated because I don't even want to entertain certain propositions. And I find myself being defensive in political views, you know, like I'm one of those people that adopted a kid. And I'll tell you, like, what I'd like to say is, hey, I'm glad that you're pro-life, but until you do something about it, shut your mouth. I'd love to say that, but it's defensive and it's barbed.
Yeah. How is it defensive?
Well, because it doesn't, there's going to be no empathy at the end of that. You know, and it's a way of saying, Tim, like, hey, you've got this opinion and you're wrong because you haven't done X about it. Now, I think it's okay for me to say, I can feel that. I really can feel that. And I need to be honest, I often have that feeling. But feelings aren't always true. And feelings don't always lead to, like, better friendships. And so, like, one of the things I loved about being in Rotary is that if anybody's a Rotarian, like, the thing you do is you're supposed to say the four-way test always. Of the things we say to other people first, is it even true? And the other criterion that I gravitate toward is, will it build better friendships? And of course, like, a lot of times it won't. Is it fair? Is it beneficial to all concerned? Usually when I say my opinion, it is none of those four things. Well, it might be true in my way of thinking, but it doesn't build friendships and it's not beneficial. And the way we express it really, really matters. And, you know, sometimes we can listen to other people really well and they don't want to listen to us at the end. But, you know, like, we're not listening to other people in order to, like, get our turn. It's not why we do that. Well,
I tried to understand how they got to that particular position. And a lot of these days I ask, well, what do you listen to? What newspapers and television stations and social media sources do you listen to? And I'll tell you, there's, once they name off their sources of information, you know where they're coming from. And that's sort of where you have to go. And sometimes you have to go listen to those sources to understand what they're telling people. They get them there. We had these people that relatives in particular only watch one TV station. They don't watch any others. And that's the entire source. My son tried in a family reunion back before the election. They had these red hats, Make America Great Again. He came to the family reunion with red hats, white letters that said, Make America Think Again. And I tell you, it really fleshed out the other side pretty quick. And unfortunately, it didn't get a dialogue going. They kind of, one of them left because of that incident. But I told my son, I said, that was a great shot. It was entertaining, but it didn't quite get there.
Well, you know, perhaps the question should be, how did you arrive at your position?
That worked.
Instead of asking where they got their position from.
Yeah.
With just an idea.
No, that's a good point. How did they arrive at their decision? A lot of times I found that they have sources of information. I said, where'd you hear that one? You know, and here we're in Arizona, in Maricopa County. We've counted our ballots 8 times. We've had the cyber ninjas in here.
And they've all had
And the
COVID.
cyber ninjas, when you really look at the list of what they're doing, they're testing QAnon theories. For example, you watch them x-raying all the ballots. They're out testing that theory that the Chinese sent rice paper ballots into Arizona and changed the election. So they're looking for rice paper. Well, they haven't found any rice paper. They haven't found anything. In fact, they haven't published anything yet. So I don't know, you know, some people really buy into all, and I'm trying to understand, how do you talk to somebody like that? How do you get there?
Yeah.
Well, you know, some of the things I think you need to think about is these cyber ninjas that were in there are doing all this stuff. They're making money off of, you know, people's crazy ideas.
Right.
So they're going to perpetuate that idea. Sometimes it's like attorneys. You know, they want you to do something just so they can earn more money, not because they believe in things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, Alan, I think you're asking the really great question here, and it's the hard question. And, you know, I got to say, because of what I do, right, like vocationally, and because of where I've come from, a lot of times I don't want to listen to evangelical people. I don't. Because I'm going to tell you, I often tell myself, and there's some truth to it, I already know what you think and why you think it. I grew up that way. Like, I know that. And so, like, the question is, I guess for me, like, how do I choose to comport myself when I'm pretty sure I already know what you think? And how would I like people to comport themselves with me when they're pretty sure they know what I already think?
Yeah, and these people who divide us into camps or seek to divide us into camps, and are pretty good at doing it, by the way. We all know that. How do we get out of that? And I've got a hypothesis that the way to get out of that is to, when we're in those family meetings with those other relatives, is to focus on things that make us the same, that bring us together.
Yeah.
Talk about the times, when we did this thing. Remember when we did this thing, and try to put them on the same team. And maybe that's a little self-serving, because I think if somebody feels like they're in the same tribe as you, they might be more open into listening to you. Yeah, it's my hypothesis. I should test it.
I think it's fair. And I do think that, you know, again, as we talk about this, like building containers of trust and compassionate listening, we want people to do that for us. And the question is, have we made that investment on their behalf as well? And quite often I want it without having put the work in, or like I've done some work, but you know, again, the question is how how far have I gone? And I got, like, we all get this sometimes at work or in families too. Sometimes people rant, or sometimes people make accusations, and that's really hard. It touches like my need to like protect myself and armor up. Like, again, if I can get in the right space, I can say, like, let's investigate that. Or if I can't, I can at least say something like, thanks for sharing your thoughts. And I've told this story, but I had this professor in college who told us about writing his dissertation and defending it. And he said that there was somebody on the panel who just laid into him and said, like, well, your work did this and your work did that, da, 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 da. And we all said, what did you do? And he said, well, I said, thank you. and we said, what? And he said, well, he didn't ask me any questions. And so sometimes, like, when there's not a question, just thank you. Thanks for your email. Thanks for your political opinion, unsolicited. I mean, like, maybe keep that last word to ourselves, but just, thanks. And we don't need to go on the offense, because I mean, again, like, as well as I do, that there's times you're not interested in listening. And let's just be clear about that. Hey, I don't want to listen to you. I just want to vent. Can you hear it? I don't do that with a lot of people, because that's a lot to ask. You can do that with a plant. You can do that with your dog. I'm so mad. I always want you to listen. Good girl. That's when you can say good girl. I want to say, oh, Darlene, please.
I'd like to support what Mike said in terms of reconciliation around things that we can agree on. Before the election, my brother and his wife were here, and they spent 3 days of turning on the television and listening to that channel that I don't allow in my house. And I spent 3 days of being quiet, really being quiet, being tolerant, loving them no matter what, or trying to. And as they were leaving, they made the mistake of asking me what I thought. And I made the mistake of saying in one sentence what I thought of their candidate. And they didn't come back to see me for 4 years. However, this last year, my brother came back to see me, and we spent 3 wonderful days of no television, no political discussion, focusing on what united us. And it was wonderful. So yay for you, Mike, and your your strategy. It worked for me.
And I want to share, I think that strategy is, it's strange. Like, it's easier, because I got 2 kids, easier with my 20-year-old than with my 9-year-old. Because with the 20-year-old, I can say, hey, my job is pretty much done, right? But what I wish and what I'm hoping is that, like, having had that goal or that connection with the 20-year-old, that I can parent the 9-year-old in a way that I get more of that connection now, and I don't have to wait. And parenting is one of those things, right? Because it's like the hardest thing there is. It's so full of shame. Don't ever read Parents Magazine. I'm going to tell you, do not read that, because it's like what I did right this weekend. I built a treehouse with my child that looks like a Disney World attraction, who's 3, and we loved every minute. I hate those people, because I hate them. Mom and I were both really clear. We can teach our daughter to swim, or we can spend the rest of the day with her. So we can't do both. So which one are we going to do? Well, we're going to pay for swim lessons. That's what we're going to do. Because we have to spend the rest of the day with this kid, right? And if we're just not those kind of people. But I do want to grow into being that kind of person. There's no reason for me to be that, like, frustrated over teaching my daughter to swim. I mean, that says more about me than about her. So I want to offer you a couple of things you could do at home and that you could do with people who you're starting to build a container of trust with. And I mentioned one of these to Jen recently. And this is something that I learned from the Imago training that I've sort of mentioned. One of the things we can do, particularly with somebody that we are building trust with, is make a discipline of saying every day, one thing I appreciate about you is. Now look, it's not a question, it's a sentence stem. So you start the sentence that way every time. One thing I appreciate about you is because, and then if we really want to do it, this book doesn't say it, but the other book does. It reminds me of that time in my childhood. This is a wonderful thing to do with your spouse after you've had a disagreement. And it can feel incredibly artificial. That's fine. I promise you it will be life-giving. I promise. Not just because the research says it and because I've done it in my own house, but I promise. And I also realize, again, and I'm not asking y'all for anything here. I'm not, but I've got a way to go. I love writing thank you notes. You probably know that. I'm like the king of the thank you note writing. And that's great. But there is an opportunity to make thank you notes more meaningful for both of us by saying, when you blank, it made me feel blank because. Instead of, hey, I appreciate your generosity, or you are so smart. And the author says, I rarely benefit from somebody telling me what I am, but I almost always benefit from somebody telling me what I did that touched their heart. Now, again, I've written a lot of thank you notes in my life, and usually I've said, thanks for the gift. Thank you for being generous. Those are evaluations instead of, your contribution to this particular thing touched my heart because blank. I'm not digging, but I will tell you, we can deepen our enjoyment of gratitude, which she talks about, by talking about what was said or done, how it touched our hearts and why. So I'll tell you, I'm in an industry, and Eric can tell you this too, and no matter whether you're a teacher or you're a priest or whatever it is you do, in any public service industry, often the feedback we get is, good job. I really enjoyed that lesson. You're a good doctor. And there's an opportunity to say, when we met to talk about my allergy issues, your spending that extra 5 minutes made me feel really valued because I perceive you're busy and you gave me that time. That's gratitude I can enjoy. When you said that thing in the lesson plan, it really touched my heart because it's the first time I heard that phrase that will allow me to go forward with people that I have trouble with. Or I'm feeling really hopeful after that liturgy in church because there was this great, attention to the natural world that I often pass over, whatever it is, right? But to like draw out our gratitude instead of just checking the box is one of those wonderful ways, I think, Alan's speaking to, how do I talk to people who I struggle with, but also like, how do I honor people that I'm close with? It sort of is a great strategy both ways. You can do that with your kids. Hey, Emery, one of the things I really appreciate about you is because, and it touched my heart, it reminds me of this own thing I did as a kid. And sometimes for the better, right? We can say, reminds me of this time when I was a kid and my need did not get met, and you did the opposite. So it's like healing this thing inside of me. I know that sounds like psychobabble, it can, but I think it's authentic and I think it's deep. And if you do something small for somebody and they come back at you with that kind of gratitude, who doesn't want that gift?
Okay.
I think the other thing that he asks us to do in tough conversations is say, I'd like you to tell me what you heard me say. I'm usually pretty convinced that I'm crystal clear, and person has just chosen not to listen or has chosen to misunderstand me. And so this like giving somebody an opportunity, and then he'll say like, I'm sorry, I didn't communicate the way I wanted to. And taking some ownership, or like, I was hoping you were going to hear this thing. Could you repeat that back? Not in a like a abusive way, but like, like this is so important to me. I want to, I want to hear what you heard me say. To be honest with you all, I'm often afraid to do things like that because I'm conflict averse, or because I don't want to be perceived as whatever. But like I see this as like an opportunity to enjoy life a lot more. I do, which is sacramental. Going back to that. I want to respect our time. Are there any other, like, do y'all have questions going forward for us to consider that we could come back to next week? Or, again, is there anything I missed? I was a little heavy-handed this week. I apologize for that.
Get my speaker.
You're on speaker.
Peggy, please.
We have family gatherings also, and we talk about with our children wants and needs. And that's been a real helpful discussion. So he kind of alluded to that a lot in these chapters, but the wants, the difference between wanting something and needing something is very significant. I need a new pair of shoes because I don't have any more. But wanting to do something is very different than what you need.
I love that you said that. And Peggy, what it touched in me is how I instill in my child this thing like a want is anything you could do without, and a need is required. And the mistake I've made is we require validation and being seen and empathy and mutuality. And those aren't wants, those are needs. Right.
Right.
The way I grew up, those are wants. You can do without those. But to be able to say to our kids, those are no, sweetie, those are needs. You need those like you need a Band-Aid. You need those like you need food. I need that stuff. I've lied to myself and said those are wants, but I need that.
Yeah, that's right.
And maybe that's the challenge of the week. Mary, please.
Well, Julia reminded me of the last minute of this, and we talked about it a bit yesterday with a group of women. I was just going to be I started practicing this communication style back in like 2015, really with a child psychologist that kind of changed our entire communication, our way of communicating with our kids, because we were having issues with our eldest. And I definitely saw a lot of fruit with changing the communication, the way we talked and stuff. But I mentioned this yesterday with the women that Julia and I were talking to, that I was talking to them about it. But there's actually, like, as I've practiced it, like I've noticed pitfalls of it, and I just want to throw this out there, and this might be something that Mike, you decide is, we're not going to go that way, but I've heard some people on the call sort of say, well, what about this? What about this? And I think it might be worthwhile to discuss some of these pitfalls. And I'll just send you a link, but there's an article that came out beginning of last year that's actually titled Nonviolent Communication is for the Privileged. Nonviolent communication is for the privileged. And just how I'm just going to leave it at that. I would encourage y'all to read it, because it doesn't say that nonviolent communication is a waste of time. It doesn't say that, but it provides some cautionary tales for these pitfalls that I've personally experienced. as a way to, when you are starting down this road, be like, wait, this feels funny. Like, what's going on here? And I think that it's helpful just to sort of know like the pitfalls that you can kind of fall into when you're practicing this. So I would just encourage y'all to look out for that. And then it can be something, you know, that, oh, I don't see that as a pitfall. I don't know why they said that, but anyway, that sort of came up when I was hearing from, I think one of you was a practiced psychology, was a therapist. And it might be just a good thing when you're embarking on nonviolent communication to know what potential pitfalls there are and be aware of them. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Mary. And if you give me that link, I'm more than happy to distribute that for the benefit of the group. So let's do this. Let's come back next week having read 2 chapters. Okay, let's try 7 and 8. 7 and 8, just 2 at a time. And please bring any questions or like, hey, I struggle with in this situation. That's really, really helpful. Thank you all for your time and your engagement, and I'll see you soon.